Welcome to the Daily Brain Podcast. Imagine a conversation where your words truly connect. Let today's word bring you closer to that reality. The word is alienation. Have you ever felt out of sync with the world around you, like you just don't belong? That's alienation, and it's something we're going to deep dive into today.
It's fascinating how alienation is woven into the fabric of human experience. We see it everywhere, in art, literature, even our everyday conversations.
Right. And while alienation might sound like a heavy topic, it's not always a bad thing. In fact, sometimes it can be a surprising catalyst for creativity and change. We've got a stack of interesting sources to help us unpack this.
One source in Bookable actually lists 14 different examples of alienation. Some are pretty straightforward, like feeling disconnected from your culture or fearing that life is meaningless. But others, like rebelliousness or even creativity, might seem unexpected.
That's what I found so intriguing is like, if you don't fit the mold, that sense of not belonging can actually push you to break free and create something new.
Exactly. Think of artists, musicians, writers. So many have harnessed their feelings of alienation to produce incredible works. It's about channeling that feeling into something constructive.
So it's not just about feeling isolated. It's also about what you do with that feeling. But this brings up another question. Alienated from what exactly? The sources point to nature, other people, meaning and purpose, and even ourselves.
It's like there are different flavors of alienation, and they can each impact us in profound ways. Let's start with nature. Do you remember, listener, that feeling of pure wonder as a child exploring the outdoors? That sense of connection to something bigger than yourself?
Totally. Climbing trees, digging in the dirt. It was pure magic.
Yeah.
But as we grow older, sometimes we lose that connection. We get caught up in our busy lives, and nature becomes something we just see out the window.
And that disconnect can have real consequences, not just for the environment, but for our own well-being. When we harm nature, we harm ourselves.
It's like cutting ourselves off from a vital source of energy and inspiration. And that sense of isolation can extend to other people too. Think about adolescence. It's like a breeding ground for feeling alienated.
Adolescence is such a vulnerable time. You're figuring out who you are, trying to fit in, dealing with social pressures, and sometimes bullying. It's no wonder that so many teens feel disconnected and alone.
And if those feelings aren't addressed, they can really linger into adulthood. This reminds me of another type of alienation, from meaning and purpose. I think we all crave a sense that our lives have value, that we're contributing something meaningful.
Absolutely. Work is often where this type of alienation shows up. The pandemic really brought this to the forefront, with many people realizing they were stuck in jobs that didn't bring them joy or a sense of fulfillment.
It's like that saying, find a job you love and you'll never work a day in your life. But for so many not. Work feels more like a chore than a calling.
And that can lead to a deep sense of alienation. It's like you're just going through the motions, feeling like a cog in a machine rather than a valued contributor. This actually connects to a concept Karl Marx explored, capitalist alienation. He argued that the way work is structured under capitalism can make people feel separated from their own creative potential and from the true value of their labor.
Wow. So this idea has been around for a while.
Uh-huh.
Okay. But for me, the most profound type of alienation is feeling alienated from yourself. It's like you're a stranger to your own thoughts and feelings.
It's a painful form of disconnect. Imagine constantly second-guessing yourself, ignoring your intuition, feeling like you're wearing a mask all the time. It can be incredibly isolating.
It's almost like you're living someone else's life, trying to meet everyone else's expectations but your own. Now, Dr. Gabor Mate, in that YouTube video we watched, also talked about alienation in modern culture. He highlighted alienation from nature, others, work, and self, which really resonates with what we've been discussing.
Yes. And Dr. May emphasizes the importance of reconnecting with ourselves and the world around us. He argues that true healing begins with recognizing and addressing the underlying causes of our alienation.
Okay. So we've talked about the different types of alienation, but what about the emotional impact? Some of the sources, like that article by Patrick Wanis and the Healthline piece, paint a pretty intense picture.
It's important to acknowledge the emotional toll of alienation, feeling lonely, unsupported, unworthy, ashamed, lost, anxious, depressed. These are all common experiences for people who feel alienated. It's like alienation creates this heavy weight that we carry around, impacting our mental and emotional well-being.
And here's where it gets even more complex, because that pain can manifest in both inward and outward directed ways. Patrick Wanis in that Healthline article both mention self-destructive behaviors like addiction and self-sabotage. But they also pointed to things like hatred and violence directed at others.
It makes you think about how societal issues like crime and social unrest could be fueled by widespread feelings of alienation. Remember those ideas of anomie and rebelliousness we talked about earlier, when people feel like they don't belong, like society has failed them? It can create a breeding ground for all sorts of problems.
It's like that feeling of, if the world rejects me, I reject the world. But this is heavy stuff.
Yeah.
What about some hope here? Is there anything we can do about alienation, both individually and as a society?
Absolutely. It's not a life sentence. And the first step is recognizing the signs of alienation in ourselves and in others. Are we withdrawing from relationships, losing interest in things we used to love? Are we feeling chronically cynical or resentful? Awareness is key.
That makes sense. But what about actually addressing those feelings? What can we do to counteract alienation?
One powerful antidote is cultivating genuine connection. And that happens on multiple levels, with ourselves, with other people, and with the natural world.
Okay, let's break that down. What does connecting with ourselves even mean? It sounds kind of abstract.
It's about learning to listen to our inner voice,
Yeah.
honoring our feelings, identifying and pursuing what truly matters to us, not what we think we should be doing. It's about self-compassion and letting go of perfectionism.
So it's about self-care and mindfulness, those practices that help us tune in to what we need.
Exactly. And when we're connected to ourselves, we can show up more authentically in our relationships with others.
Speaking of relationships, how do we build those genuine connections with other people when we're feeling alienated?
It starts with being present, being a good listener, being open to understanding other people's perspectives, even if we don't agree with them. It's about creating safe spaces where people feel seen and heard without judgment.
I love that. And isn't that part of what we're trying to do here with the Daily Brain podcast? Creating a space for listeners to connect with these ideas, to feel like they're part of the conversation.
Absolutely. And it highlights how important these spaces are, where we can share our thoughts and feelings and realize we're not alone.
Because when we feel connected to others, we feel less isolated, less alienated. Okay? So we have self-connection, human connection. What about connecting with nature? We touched on this earlier, but I'm curious to hear more about how that plays a role.
Think about it. Spending time in nature can be incredibly grounding and restorative. It helps us tap into that sense of awe and wonder we might have felt as children. Whether it's a walk in the woods gardening or simply sitting under a tree, nature has a way of reminding us that we're part of something larger than ourselves.
And that sense of belonging, of being part of something bigger, can be a powerful antidote to feeling alienated. It helps us see that we're not alone in this vast universe.
It's like returning to our roots, remembering our place in the interconnected web of life.
I love that analogy. It makes me think about how we often seek connection through technology and social media. But sometimes the most profound connections happen when we unplug and get back in touch with the natural world.
It's about finding that balance between the digital and the natural, recognizing the value of both. But let's be realistic. Not everyone has easy access to nature, and even those who do might struggle to feel that connection. So what about people who are feeling deeply alienated right now? Where do they start?
That's a great question. It can feel overwhelming when you're stuck in that feeling of disconnection. What advice would you give to someone who's struggling?
Remember that reaching out for help is a sign of strength, not weakness. Talking to a therapist, joining a support group, connecting with a trusted friend or family member. These can all be invaluable resources for navigating feelings of alienation. There's no shame in asking for support.
And there are so many online resources now, too. Forums, apps, websites where people can connect with others who understand what they're going through.
Exactly. You're not alone.
Okay.
Alienation is a common human experience, and there are people who care and want to help you find your way back to connection.
Okay, but what about that surprising idea we touched on earlier? The concept that morality itself can be alienating. I'm still wrapping my head around that.
It's a fascinating concept, isn't it? The idea that systems of morality, even those with good intentions, can sometimes lead to feelings of alienation. It raises some important questions about how we balance universal ethical principles with our own personal values and experiences.
So it's like trying to be a good person could actually distance us from the things that matter most to us. That's a tough pill to swallow.
It challenges us to examine our own moral compass, to ask ourselves if our beliefs and actions are truly aligned with who we are at our core.
So it's about finding a moral framework that feels authentic and meaningful to us personally, not just blindly following rules or expectations.
Exactly, and sometimes that means questioning conventional wisdom, challenging authority, and forging our own path. It's about finding a way to live in alignment with our values, even if that means going against the grain.
That's a powerful message. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today. The many faces of alienation, its causes, its consequences, and even its potential to be both destructive and transformative. But one quote keeps coming back to me. If alienation can be both a negative force and a catalyst for positive change, how do we navigate its complexities?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's something we all have to grapple with in our own lives. There's no easy answer. But I think it starts with recognizing that alienation exists on a spectrum.
Okay, unpack that for me.
Yeah.
What do you mean by a spectrum?
It means that we can experience varying degrees of alienation at different times and in different areas of our lives. We might feel deeply alienated from our work, but deeply connected to our family and friends. Or we might feel alienated from our culture, but connected to a particular subculture or community. It's not an all-or-nothing situation.
So it's more nuanced than simply saying, I am alienated or I am not alienated.
Exactly. And recognizing that nuance allows us to approach alienation with more compassion and understanding. It allows us to see the potential for both growth and destruction in those feelings of disconnect.
So how do we harness the potential for growth?
Yeah.
How do we turn alienation into a catalyst for positive change in our own lives?
It starts with understanding the root of our alienation. What are we feeling disconnected from? Why? And once we understand the source of the problem, we can start to address it in a meaningful way.
So it all comes back to self-reflection,
Yeah.
to honest self-appraisal. That's where real change begins.
Absolutely. And then it's about taking action, finding ways to reconnect with what truly matters to us, whether it's our authentic selves, our loved ones, our communities, or the natural world.
Yeah.
It's about finding our place in the world, even if that means creating it ourselves.
That's such an empowering message.
Okay.
But what about those who are struggling to take that first step? Who are feeling overwhelmed by feelings of alienation and don't know where to turn?
Remember that you're not alone. There are people who care and want to help. Reaching out is a sign of strength, not weakness. Try different things. Therapy support groups, creative expression, spending time in nature, volunteering, until you find what works for you. There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
It's about finding what resonates with you, what helps you feel more connected and grounded in the world.
Exactly. It's a journey, and it's not always easy, but connection is essential to our well-being, to our happiness, and to our ability to thrive. So keep searching, keep exploring, and don't give up on finding your way back to connection.
I love that. So much wisdom in those words. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground. But before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a thought-provoking question. If alienation can be both a negative force and a catalyst for positive change, how have you experienced alienation in your own life, listener?
Take a moment to reflect on those experiences. What have they taught you? And what steps can you take today to cultivate deeper connection with yourself, with others, and with the world around you?
Because even small acts of connection can make a big difference. A kind word to a stranger. A phone call to a friend you haven't spoken to in a while. A walk in the park. These seemingly simple actions can ripple outwards, creating a more connected and compassionate world.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into alienation. It's been a fascinating journey exploring both the dark and light sides of this complex human experience.
It really has. And I think the biggest takeaway for me is that we don't have to be afraid of alienation. We can choose to see it as a teacher, as an opportunity for growth and self-discovery.
I love that perspective. Instead of running from those feelings of alienation, we can lean into them, explore them, and use them as fuel for positive change in our lives.
Exactly. So to our listeners, we encourage you to keep exploring this idea. Think about how alienation has shown up in your own life. What has it taught you? And what steps can you take today to cultivate those deeper connections with yourself, with others, with the world around you?
Remember, even the smallest acts of connection can make a difference. A smile to a stranger, a phone call to a friend you haven't spoken to in a while. Taking a few moments to appreciate the beauty of nature. These seemingly simple things can ripple outwards and create a more connected and compassionate world.
Beautifully said.
Yeah.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into alienation. Thank you for joining us on this journey of exploration and discovery. Until next time, stay curious, stay connected, and keep those brains buzzing.